I had just stepped down from my truck in front of the last house on the street when Marlene Whitaker, president of the Homeowners Association, blocked my path and called me a trespasser. She laughed when I told her I had every right to be there, then pulled out her phone and told the dispatcher a suspicious man was trying to seize community property. 10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled through the gate. Marlene crossed her arms and waited to watch me get handcuffed, but the officer who stepped out looked at the paperwork, looked at me, and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, this man owns the whole neighborhood." She did not ask my name. She did not ask to see identification. She simply looked at my truck, my scuffed boots, and the toolbox riding in the bed, and decided everything she needed to know about me in about 4 seconds. A few residents had gathered near the mailboxes pretending to check for packages while they watched the scene unfold. Marlene told me I was trespassing on association land and that if I did not leave immediately, she would have security tow my truck before lunch. When I told her I had a key to the house behind her, she smiled the way people smile right before they say something designed to wound. "Men like you," she said, loud enough for the little audience to hear, "tend to confuse holding a key with owning a house." I did not argue with her. I only asked whether she was certain she wanted to turn this into a matter for the police. My calm seemed to bother her more than any argument could have, because Marlene Whitaker was used to being feared, not humored. She was 57 years old, dressed like she was heading to a luncheon rather than standing on a cul-de-sac, and she had run this association for 6 years, the way some people run a small kingdom. Before the story rewinds to explain how I ended up standing in front of that house, I should say this plainly. This was not the first time Marlene had tried to push me off property that already belonged to me. It was only the first time she had tried to do it in front of a police officer. She still believed at that moment that I was some hired laborer who had wandered past the gate with a bag of tools and a bad attitude. She had no idea that the ground she was standing on, the community building behind her, and even the private road beneath her expensive shoes were all still legally mine. I am 42 years old, and I spent the better part of a decade working as a records investigator for the county, tracing property lines, easements, and ownership disputes that most people never think about until they find themselves in the middle of one. That work taught me something most people never learn. Paper outlasts memory, and memory is exactly what people like Marlene rely on when they want a community to forget who actually owns what. After leaving the county, I started buying and repairing struggling real estate projects, the kind of half-finished developments that banks were desperate to unload for pennies on the dollar. I never wore a suit to a closing if I could help it, and I never felt the need to announce what I owned to strangers who had already decided what they thought of me. I let Marlene believe whatever she wanted to believe for 3 more days, because I needed to understand exactly what kind of trouble I had bought myself before I let her know who I was. Standing there at the gate that first morning, watching her size me up in under 5 seconds, I felt something I recognized immediately from years of county work. I had seen that same posture in a dozen other people who believed the rules only applied to whoever did not have the confidence to break them. 3 days before that phone call to 911, I finished closing on the Briar Glen Land Company, purchasing it from a bank that had been quietly liquidating distressed assets for the better part of a year. Briar Glen Estates had been designed as a community of 100 homes surrounding an artificial lake, but the original developer collapsed financially after only 74 houses were built. When a developer fails before a project reaches full build-out, ownership of the shared land does not simply evaporate. It stays exactly where the paperwork says it stays, whether anyone remembers that or not. The Homeowners Association had been granted temporary management of certain amenities while the development sat unfinished, but the deeds told a different story than the one Marlene had been telling residents for 6 years. The private road, the artificial lake, the community clubhouse, and 26 unbuilt lots all remained the legal property of the land company, subject only to a modest annual maintenance and use agreement. Somewhere along the way, Marlene had convinced an entire neighborhood that the old developer had simply vanished into thin air and that the association now owned everything by default, and nobody had ever bothered to check the county records to see if that was true. My original plan had nothing to do with confrontation. I intended to finish what the previous developer never could: repave the crumbling sections of road, correct a drainage problem that had been flooding 3 backyards every spring, and eventually transfer the shared property to the association through a proper legal process. That was the whole plan, quiet and unremarkable, until I opened the company's old files and started finding things that made my stomach turn. The association had stopped paying its modest lease on the clubhouse 4 years earlier, yet somehow it kept operating the building as though it belonged to them outright. Worse than that, violation notices had been sent to the land company itself, the very entity that owned the ground the violation supposedly occurred on. The association had also declared that it held the authority to seize the 26 vacant lots because the grass had grown too tall, despite having no ownership interest in that land whatsoever. And buried near the bottom of one folder sat a signature page, supposedly from a former developer representative, dated more than a year after that same man had passed away. I sat at my kitchen table late into the night with that signature page spread out under a desk lamp, comparing it against 3 earlier documents the man had genuinely signed while he was still alive, and the differences in the handwriting were not subtle once I knew where to look. I called Avery Sloan the next morning, before I had even finished my coffee. She was 39 years old, sharp and unflinching in the way that only comes from years of untangling other people's real estate disasters, and she had a habit of asking the one question everyone else in the room was too polite to ask. When I read her the line about seizing vacant lots over overgrown grass, she laughed without any humor in it at all, and told me she had seen homeowners associations invent creative justifications before, but rarely anything quite this bold. She told me not to walk in waving deeds and demanding answers until I understood exactly what Marlene Whitaker was hiding and how deep it went. Avery spent that entire afternoon on the phone with the county recorder's office while I drove out to look at the lake and the clubhouse from a distance, careful not to draw attention before I was ready. What she found only confirmed what the files already suggested. The association had never filed a single document formally accepting transfer of the shared property from the land company, not once in 6 years, yet its newsletters and its annual budget both referred to the clubhouse and the lake as association assets without qualification. Somewhere between the truth sitting quietly in the county archive and the story residents had been told at every annual meeting, an entire neighborhood had been convinced of something that had never actually happened. So I decided to enter Briar Glen not as the new owner announcing himself, but as a quiet inspector checking on aging infrastructure. I told myself it would only take a week or 2 to gather what I needed before revealing anything. I had no idea, driving through that gate for the first time, that Marlene Whitaker would be waiting there as if some instinct had already warned her that trouble had arrived in a used pickup truck. She stopped my vehicle at the gate itself and demanded to see a contractor's license before I could even roll my window all the way down. I handed her a business card that read Voss Property Holdings, and she glanced at it for less than a second before tossing it back through the window like it had offended her. She told me the community did not hire men who wandered around with a toolbox and no appointment, and when I asked what authority she had to stop the owner of the property from inspecting it, she informed me that at Briar Glen she decided who counted as a legitimate owner. That conversation revealed everything I needed to know about how Marlene viewed men who worked with their hands. She assumed I understood wrenches and shingles, but nothing about contracts or law. She interrupted every attempt I made to explain the property records, cutting me off before I could finish a single sentence. She told me, without a trace of embarrassment, that a man dressed the way I was could not possibly afford the cheapest house in her neighborhood. She bragged that she had already outmaneuvered 3 male attorneys over the years and had no intention of being fooled by another man pretending to understand a contract. While she talked, I noticed details that told their own story. The security camera mounted at the entrance was angled toward the residents' driveways rather than the actual gate, which struck me as an odd choice for a camera meant to monitor trespassers. A prohibition sign had been staked into a strip of grass that, according to my new survey documents, did not belong to the association at all. The guard posted at the booth had no visible license or credentials of any kind, just a rented uniform and a clipboard. Later that evening, a retired survey engineer named Caleb Finch found his way to my truck under the cover of dusk. Caleb was 68 years old, sharp-eyed and clearly still furious about something that had happened to him years earlier. He told me Marlene had a habit of using fines to silence anyone who questioned her, and that he himself had once been fined $9,000 for placing a survey marker on land that was, by every legal definition, his own. He handed me an old plat map showing, in black and white, that the clubhouse, the lake, and the main road had never actually been transferred to the association in the first place. Before he disappeared back into the dark toward his own porch light, Caleb offered a warning that stuck with me for the rest of that week. He said Marlene was not afraid of a man showing up with paperwork because most people never bothered to read paperwork all the way through. What frightened her, he said, was the possibility that someone might show up with enough paperwork that everyone else finally started reading it too. The next morning, an envelope appeared taped to the door of the model home the land company still owned at the end of the street. Inside was a notice claiming the association had placed a lien of $47,600 against the property for a long list of supposed violations. According to the notice, the house had an unapproved roof replacement that had never actually occurred, an unauthorized commercial vehicle parked on the property that happened to be my personal truck, unpaid pool fees attached to 26 vacant lots, interference with board operations, and a refusal to identify the property's true owner. The signature belonged to Preston Pike, the association's treasurer, a nervous man of 51 who clearly signed whatever was placed in front of him. I drove straight to the association office and asked to see the meeting minutes that supposedly authorized this lien. Marlene refused, insisting that such records were reserved for homeowners only, and when I reminded her that I represented the legal owner of 26 lots within her community, she looked at me with something between pity and contempt. "You might be the man who delivers their mail," she said, "but you are not the sort of person who signs deals like this." I realized in that moment that Marlene did not simply misjudge me by accident. She needed to believe that the man standing in front of her held no real power, because her entire scheme depended on nobody with real power ever showing up to question it. Avery checked the county recorder's office that same afternoon and confirmed the lien had never actually been filed, meaning Marlene had only created the notice to frighten me into leaving before I asked too many questions. Despite the empty threat, she had already scheduled an emergency meeting to formally push the lien through, and I decided to attend without revealing the full extent of what I owned. Buried at the very bottom of that meeting's printed agenda was a final item that made my jaw tighten when I first read it: reclaiming abandoned lots for the benefit of the community. Over the following 2 days, I began speaking privately with residents away from Marlene's cameras and her circle of loyalists. During daylight hours, Most people avoided even making eye contact with me, worried about fines for offenses as vague as talking to the wrong person near the mailboxes. At night, though, they came to the model home one at a time, arriving quietly with folders of paperwork clutched against their chests like contraband. One homeowner had been fined for curtains the board decided were not sufficiently uniform with the rest of the street. Another had been billed for legal fees simply for requesting a copy of the association's bank statements. A young couple 2 doors down from the clubhouse told me they had been threatened with a lien over a garden bed. Marlene claimed violated a landscaping rule that, as it turned out, did not actually exist in any version of the association's official bylaws. They had spent nearly $300 hiring an outside attorney just to write a single letter disputing a fine that should never have existed in the first place. Money they told me they still had not fully recovered from a year later. A widow named Ruth Calloway sat at my kitchen table with her hands folded tightly in her lap and told me she had paid every fine Marlene ever sent her without question, simply because she was afraid of what might happen to her small pension if the association ever took her to court. A former board member named Walter Higgins had been forced to resign after Marlene spread word around the neighborhood that he had embezzled funds, though she never produced a shred of evidence to support the accusation. Walter told me he had considered fighting back at the time, but Marlene made it clear through a mutual friend that she would make his life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork if he tried. And after 30 years living on that street, he decided quiet retirement was worth more to him than a fight he was not certain he could win alone. Listening to story after story that first night, I began to understand that the lien on my model home and the false police report that would follow days later were not isolated incidents at all, but simply the newest chapter in a pattern that had been repeating itself for years. I made no promises to avenge anyone. I only asked each person to keep every invoice, every email, and every set of minutes they still had in their possession, and told them that documentation, patient and thorough, was worth more than any argument shouted across a folding table. Preston Pike arrived last, well after midnight, looking like a man who had not slept properly in months. He admitted that Marlene routinely handed him documents to sign after meetings had already ended, always assuring him that everything had been properly approved beforehand. When he once tried to push back, she threatened to bury him in fines severe enough to cost him his own home. Before he left that night, he pressed a small flash drive into my hand, the kind of gesture that felt heavier than its size suggested. The files on that drive told a story far larger than a handful of unfair fines. There were consulting invoices paid to a company owned by Marlene's own brother, emails discussing the sale of the vacant lots to a resort developer, and a draft announcement falsely declaring that the original land company had abandoned all claim to its remaining property. One message stood out above the rest. A line Marlene had typed to a colleague without any apparent fear of consequences. If we can simply manufacture a trespassing report, we can tie up any new owner in court for months. That single sentence told me the phone call to the police 3 days later had never been an impulsive reaction. It was, in fact, a plan she had been quietly preparing before I ever set foot near that gate. What I still lacked was proof that she actually knew who the new owner was. Near the bottom of one of the emails, she had referred to N. Voss dismissively, describing him as an aging investor who would never bother showing up in person. The emergency meeting took place inside the very clubhouse my company still legally owned, a detail Marlene had apparently never bothered to verify. She sat at the center of a folding table on a small stage as though she were presiding over a courtroom rather than a homeowners meeting. When she introduced me to the room, she called me a man impersonating a representative of the property owner in order to intimidate the association, and a ripple of unease moved through the seated residents. She refused to let me speak for more than a sentence or two at a time, striking a gavel against the table whenever I mentioned a deed or a recorded document. She mocked my profession openly, telling the room that knowing how to read a survey map did not make a man qualified to understand contract law. At one point, she turned to the audience and asked, with a small laugh meant to invite the room to laugh along with her, whether anyone present truly believed a man who arrived in work boots could possibly hold the kind of paperwork she was describing. A few scattered chuckles rose from her usual allies near the front row, though I noticed most of the room stayed silent, watching me carefully instead of her. Caleb sat near the back with his arms crossed, saying nothing, waiting the way a man waits when he already knows how a story is going to end but has learned the value of patience over the years. Her proposed resolution that evening had 3 parts: banning me permanently from entering Briar Glen, formally recording the lien against every unbuilt lot, and authorizing the board to negotiate a sale of those very lots to outside buyers. I asked only one question before I was escorted out. I asked whether she had ever bothered to confirm who actually owned the building she was currently standing inside. She answered that the association had used the clubhouse for years and therefore obviously owned it, a claim she stated with total confidence and absolutely no supporting evidence. I handed Preston a copy of the original lease agreement and asked him to read aloud the section describing termination for non-payment, but Marlene snatched the paper from his hands before he finished the first sentence, calling it a forgery and ordering security to remove me from the property. As 2 guards walked me toward the door, I informed the room in a calm voice that I intended to return the following morning to inspect the model home and the surrounding road. Marlene shouted after me that if I dared to return, she would personally call the police and watch me get handcuffed in front of everyone. I stopped at the doorway just long enough to answer her. "Tomorrow," I said, "you should make sure the officer reads the file before he listens to you." The next morning, I arrived at the model home carrying a camera, the plat maps Caleb had given me, and the original set of keys that had come with the sale of the land company. Avery was on her way with a freshly stamped copy of the county deed, though traffic had delayed her by nearly an hour. Sometime overnight, Marlene had ordered the gate lock to the property changed, and a hand-lettered sign now hung on the front door reading association property, "No trespassing." I filmed the entire scene before touching anything, then used a spare key to let myself in through the side entrance rather than force the changed lock. Marlene appeared within minutes, flanked by a guard and a small cluster of residents she had apparently summoned in advance to serve as witnesses. She called me an intruder over and over, loud enough that her voice carried across 3 neighboring yards. And when I offered my driver's license and a copy of the recorded deed, she refused even to glance in their direction. She declared that paperwork belonging to a man dressed the way I was dressed amounted to nothing more than something printed off the internet. I warned her, as calmly as I could manage, that changing the locks on a property her association did not own could reasonably be considered an act of trespass on her part rather than mine. She laughed at that idea and told me no police officer in the county would take the word of a man in work boots over the word of a homeowners association president. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She told the dispatcher that an aggressive man had broken a lock, that he was carrying tools that could be used to force entry, that he was refusing to leave community property, and that she and several residents felt genuinely threatened by his presence. I had not moved toward her at any point, nor had I raised my voice. I set my toolbox down on the ground, stepped back a reasonable distance, and continued recording everything on my phone. She instructed the guard to block my truck so I could not simply drive away before the police arrived, a decision that would later prove to be one more mistake layered on top of the false report. The footage now clearly showed her attempting to physically detain someone at a scene she herself had summoned officers to using fabricated information. A few residents had drifted closer by then, drawn by the raised voices, and I noticed several of them recording on their own phones, which was exactly the kind of independent documentation Avery had told me would matter later if this ever went further than a heated morning in a driveway. Marlene used the waiting time to build her case for the small crowd that had gathered. She told them I had shown up uninvited at dawn, that I had been caught prying at a locked door, and that she had personally seen tools in my hands consistent with forced entry. None of it was true, and she knew it was not true, but she said it with the same confidence she used for everything else, as though repetition alone could turn a lie into a fact. One neighbor asked quietly whether anyone had actually seen me break anything, and Marlene brushed the question aside without answering it, the same way she had brushed aside every uncomfortable question for 6 straight years. When the sound of a patrol car finally reached us, Marlene straightened her blazer, smiled with obvious satisfaction, and leaned close enough to speak just for me. "Men like you," she said quietly, "only learn manners once they've been handcuffed a time or two." Sergeant Grant Holloway stepped out of the vehicle a moment later, looked directly at me, and I could see recognition settle across his face almost instantly. Grant did not simply take Marlene's version of events at face value the way she had clearly expected him to. He separated the two of us and asked each person to explain what had happened, one account at a time, without interruption. Marlene spoke first, leaning heavily on her title as association president, insisting that I had broken into a shared community building and might be preparing to seize even more property before the day was over. Grant asked whether she had personally witnessed me breaking the lock with her own eyes. She hesitated, then said it was obvious what must have happened, without actually answering his question. I handed him my phone, and the footage showed clearly that the lock had already been changed by the association before I ever arrived, and that I had entered through a side door using a legitimate key that had come with the property. Avery arrived moments later out of breath, carrying a certified copy of the county records. Grant reviewed each document carefully and without rushing, checking the listed owner of the model home, the roster of 26 lots belonging to the Briar Glen Land Company, the recorded deed covering the private road, the lake, and the clubhouse, and the paperwork confirming that I now controlled that very company. He also found the written notice I had sent the association days earlier, informing them of my planned property inspection. Marlene tried repeatedly to interject, insisting I had only purchased some meaningless paper company and had no real claim to anything inside her neighborhood. Grant held up a hand and asked her, quite reasonably, whether she had ever personally verified any of the association's claims to the shared property before repeating them to residents for 6 consecutive years. She did not have an answer for that either, only a rising defensiveness that made the small crowd around us go noticeably quiet. He flipped back through the pages Avery had brought, checking dates and signatures against a small notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, taking his time in a way that told me he had done this kind of careful sorting before, and did not intend to rush it now for anyone's comfort. I watched Marlene's expression shift while she waited, the certainty in her posture cracking just slightly at the edges, though she was still too far into her own story to abandon it completely. Grant turned toward her then and spoke in a voice calm enough that everyone standing nearby could hear every word clearly. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "Mr. Voss did not trespass on association property. This house belongs to his company. So does the road you're standing on, the clubhouse, and the land around that lake. Put simply, he owns this neighborhood." That sentence did not mean I owned the individual homes belonging to families who had bought and paid for them fair and square. What it did mean was that nearly everything Marlene had spent years claiming belonged to the association actually still belonged to my company. Sitting there in black and white on paper, she had never once bothered to verify. A few of the residents standing nearby actually laughed out loud, while others quietly raised their phones to record what was happening. Marlene's confidence drained from her face within seconds, replaced by something close to panic, and she accused Grant of taking sides against her. Grant reminded her calmly that filing a false report with emergency dispatch and physically obstructing a property owner's vehicle both carried real legal consequences. He instructed the guard to move the blocking vehicle away from my truck immediately. I never once asked him to arrest Marlene that morning. I only asked that everything he had witnessed be entered accurately and completely into his written report. As Grant prepared to leave the scene, Avery stepped forward and handed Marlene formal notice of a special meeting called to consider removing the entire board from office. Footage of that confrontation spread through Briar Glen faster than any newsletter the association had ever printed. For what felt like the first time in 6 years, residents stopped lowering their voices whenever Marlene's name came up in conversation. Avery and I spent the following days gathering signatures and proxy authorizations from homeowners eager to finally have their say. Between the voting power tied to the 26 lots owned by my company and the overwhelming support of residents who had quietly suffered under Marlene for years, we easily secured the majority needed to force a special meeting. When that meeting finally arrived, I chose to sit among the residents rather than up on the stage, wanting it perfectly clear that my goal was never to replace one dictator with another. Marlene made one final attempt to save herself, claiming loudly that I intended to evict everyone and turn Briar Glen into a private resort. I stood and presented the very contract that proved she was the one quietly negotiating to sell association-controlled land to an outside resort developer, not me. Preston finally admitted in front of the entire room that he had signed countless documents under direct pressure and threats to his own home. A forensic accountant named Tessa Rowe, hired independently to review 6 years of financial records, laid out numbers that left the room silent. She reported that $146,000 had been paid out as consulting fees with no identifiable services ever rendered, that $38,000 had gone toward meals, hotel stays, and personal travel expenses, that numerous fines had been quietly erased for residents who remained loyal to Marlene, and that meeting minutes had been edited well after residents had already signed off on the original versions. Marlene still tried to dismiss me publicly as some laborer who had simply gotten lucky with money. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that this had never truly been about money or my profession in the first place. The real issue, I said, was that she had built her entire authority on the assumption that an ordinary-looking man could never possibly hold power over her, and that the same assumption had apparently worked on every other person in this room for years before I ever arrived. A murmur moved through the crowd at that, not of surprise exactly, but of recognition. The sound of people realizing out loud that they had all quietly known something was wrong, long before anyone found the courage to say so. Ruth Calloway stood up from her seat near the middle of the room and asked, in a voice steadier than I expected, whether the fines she had paid over the years might ever be returned to her now that the truth was finally out in the open. Avery assured her that restitution would be part of the process moving forward, and I watched something loosen in the older woman's shoulders that had clearly been held tight for a very long time. When the vote was finally called, the result was overwhelming and immediate. Marlene, along with 2 board members who had remained loyal to her throughout, was removed from office on the spot, right there in the very clubhouse her association had never actually owned. As she was leaving the stage for the final time, Marlene warned that I would pay dearly for what I had done to her. Avery answered simply that the first invoice had already been mailed to her that afternoon. Every fraudulent fine and every unrecorded lien tied to Marlene's tenure was formally canceled within the following weeks. The complete financial records were forwarded both to county investigators and to the association's insurance carrier for further review. Marlene now faces a civil lawsuit demanding repayment of misused association funds, along with a permanent restriction barring her from ever accessing homeowner records or accounts again. She is also under investigation for filing a false police report and for altering official meeting minutes. And she has been billed for the cost of replacing the lock she illegally changed, along with damages for disrupting my access to property I legally owned. Should she fail to satisfy the resulting civil judgment, she may ultimately lose her own home as a consequence. Ruth Calloway and 11 other residents received refunds for fines that Tessa's audit confirmed had never been justified by any actual violation, a process that took the better part of 2 months but felt, by every account I heard afterward, like the first honest transaction the association had completed in years. Walter Higgins was formally invited back to serve on the new interim board, an offer he accepted with a kind of quiet dignity that told me more about the man than any of his earlier explanations had managed to. I turned down every suggestion that I take over as association president myself. That role was never one I wanted, and handing genuine authority back to the people who actually lived on that street struck me as the only outcome that made any real sense after everything that had happened. Instead, I helped establish a temporary board made up entirely of residents who had no ties whatsoever to Marlene's old regime. I used company funds to repair the most dangerous stretch of road in the community, insisting that every contract involved be made fully public from start to finish. Once the new leadership had settled into a stable rhythm, I agreed to transfer the clubhouse and the surrounding lake property into a proper community trust for a token payment of $1 single. In exchange, the association adopted a new set of governing rules meant to prevent anything like this from happening again. Board presidents would now be limited to fixed terms rather than indefinite reign. Financial statements would be published for every homeowner to review each quarter. No lien could ever be recorded again without an independent legal review beforehand. Every significant board meeting would be recorded for the record, and residents would have guaranteed access to their own community's documents without fear of retaliation. I never set out to tear Briar Glen apart. I only forced it, finally, to become the kind of community it had always claimed to be. Months later, I drove my same worn-out truck back through the gates of Briar Glen, and this time the entrance looked entirely different. The gate itself had finally been repaired, the threatening sign was long gone, and the meeting room no longer displayed a single photograph of Marlene Whitaker anywhere on its walls. Caleb stood near the water's edge, joking that a man with enough money to buy an entire neighborhood still refused to trade in his old truck for something newer. I told him that truck had never once judged me based on the clothes I happened to be wearing that day. Marlene had put her house up for sale not long after the vote and had barely been seen around the community since. I felt no real satisfaction in watching her lose everything she had built. What actually settled something in me was knowing she no longer had the power to control an entire neighborhood through fear alone. Grant passed by in his patrol car one afternoon, rolled down his window, and asked with a small grin whether I had run into any more trespassers lately. I looked out at the road, the clubhouse, and a group of residents gathering for their very first self-organized meeting, and gave him the only honest answer I had. "No," I said. "We just finished getting rid of the last person who thought she owned all of this." Preston Pike stayed on the new board through its first full year, showing up early to every meeting with a stack of receipts, organized more carefully than anything Marlene had ever produced in 6 years of leadership. He told me once, standing near the lake on a quiet evening, that he had spent years assuming fear was simply part of living in an organized community, something everyone quietly tolerated because the alternative seemed like too much trouble. He said it took a stranger in a work truck to show him that the trouble had always belonged to Marlene, not to the people she had spent years frightening into silence. Tessa Rowe's final accounting report became something of a quiet legend around Briar Glen, the kind of document new residents were handed alongside their welcome packet as a reminder of what unchecked authority could do to a neighborhood left unwatched for too long. I never asked to see it held up as an example, but I understood why the new board wanted it there. Some lessons are worth keeping close, even after the person responsible for teaching them has moved away and stopped answering her phone. I still think, sometimes, about the exact moment Marlene decided a man in a beat-up truck could not possibly own the ground beneath her feet. It was never really about deeds or lawsuits or lien filings in the end. It was about a woman who had built an entire kingdom on the assumption that certain people would never bother to check whether the throne was actually hers to begin with. Caleb likes to say that Briar Glen never actually needed a new king, only someone willing to open the old filing cabinets nobody had touched in years. I think he is mostly right about that, though I would put it a little differently myself. Every neighborhood eventually finds out exactly how much power its leaders actually hold, and the only question is whether that discovery comes through patient records or through a shouting match in someone's driveway. The story ends with me driving back toward that same house at the end of the street, the very place where Marlene Whitaker once called the police to have me arrested. This time, when I pulled up to the door, there was nobody standing in the way, only the quiet sound of the lake and a neighborhood finally learning how to run itself honestly.